This is the Wandering Mind.
Welcome everyone to the Wandering Mind. Today I'm here with Katie. Hey Katie, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Of course, I'm looking forward to our conversation. I'm eager to talk about you, your journey, your life. So to get us started, if you do just want to introduce yourself to the people, tell us who you are, anything about your life, your journey, what it is you do.
Thanks. Yeah, my name's Katie Turner. I'm a psychologist in Canada. I'm in Alberta. But and I've worked in private practice for over a decade now. I my focus is really working on kind of deeper level healing for people. And I do a lot of work with spiritual awakenings or helping people connect with their own intuition. So I recently wrote and published a book on that topic, really based on my own journey and the work over the past almost 2 decades with different clients who because when you get into kind of spiritual spaces, it's one of those topics, if you Google it, you get a lot of different answers. I often call it like the Wild
Right.
West of responses. And there's some really common things that come up that can be challenges for people in navigating that or even potential dangers that they may not be aware of. So, I kind of recently put that book out and have been speaking more on that subject because I went through my own spiritual awakening after I was already in psychology. I didn't really believe in any of it before, didn't really know what I believed, but then I started to have experiences that really shifted my sense of reality and really like I strongly have experienced that there's more out there and have had actual like validation of a lot of that intuition of things my rational mind couldn't have known. So if someone would have told me like 20 years ago that I'd be doing this or specializing in this, never would have believed them.
Right. Um, so if you want to, let's talk about that in a little bit more detail because um, for me in my life, I had some friends that were like more spiritual, and they would sort of kind of always say, well, psychology isn't the real deal. You know, you have to be these spiritual practices. And I also had some friends when I was studying that were into psychology, and most of them weren't really that open to spiritual side. So I actually find that quite interesting that you combine the two and coming from the psychology background. If you want to take us a little bit more into your journey, and as you said, like 20 years ago, you would have never thought you'd be here. So how did that develop for yourself?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I definitely think there's value in both worlds. And there's no, before I even get into journey, I think there's no one path that works for everybody. So we need to find our own way and our own guidance, what resonates for us, like what helps. But I do think we're on that spiritual level, like spiritual being, we're also still having a human experience and a human nervous system. So I wasn't raised religious or spiritual. I didn't really know it was a lot more. I gravitated more science base wise. I wouldn't have described myself as intuitive. I found out later I'm empathic, so I feel emotions and sensations mostly, but I didn't have psychic experiences at that time. That kind of came later. So I kind of just a lot of it is I sometimes people ask like what is a spiritual awakening, and I'd say it's actually the transformational experience where you experience like a knowing or a connection with something bigger than yourself. And spirituality, it's your personal relationship with that and your personal experience. It can be connected with religion, but not always. Like it can also be completely separate. So, because religion is more like this is the group, the rules, the rituals. So sometimes people get confused about what each of those are. Uh, I think the awakening piece is really more it is like a felt sensory experience where it is a knowing. It's not a thought rational exercise of, well, I believe like here's this research from quantum physics or here's this philosophy of like why does God exist or not or that is there more. That all gets into like an intellectual debate whereas a spiritual experience is or awakening. Sometimes it's one experience, it can be a series of them where you're like, "Oh, I know, like something happened and I know there's more going on." Um, And that pathway can be very different for different people. So for me, I really stumbled into it. I wasn't consciously looking for it or realizing what I was looking for it, but knowing what I know now, I actually was doing a lot of things that would have actually increased that connection or that likelihood because I basically burnt out in psychology. I love to travel as well. I traveled a lot kind of in my
Mm.
20s and I would go to school, work, and then kind of take off for months or longer at a time. And I got a one-way ticket to India, and I ended up being in India and Nepal for about 9 months, and that's where I started
Oh,
to
cool.
explore, like, a lot more in-depth meditation, breath work, energy work. So, really, for people who wanna connect with intuition, now I know getting out of your rational mind is really important and having those times when you are in the present moment or things can just kind of in more of a flow state where stuff can just come in, and things like yoga, meditation, spiritual practices can open up that connection more and more. I just didn't know that that could happen. So and sometimes
Right.
too, for some people, that might not be a safe thing to do. Like if that's destabilizing, for most people, it's gonna be fine, but and that's why I think because I tend to work with a lot of clients who are either skeptical, but they're open to the spirituality, and because I have the professional training, they're more open to maybe come work with me than they might be with, like, here's
Yeah.
an energy healer, someone who's gonna work with crystals with you. They might be like, "That's too far for me right now."
Right.
And then I also get a lot of clients who wouldn't see a typical psychologist because, I mean, my training, if we look at the DSM, like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there aren't a lot of places where Western psychology can classify expanded states of consciousness, spiritual experiences. If we're getting into, seeing, sensing, feeling things that other people don't sense or feel, a lot of times that can get flagged as like concerns about psychosis. And again, I
Mm.
think there's a lot of benefit in both worlds because I've worked with probably thousands of different people at this point. Like sometimes there's cases where the spiritual experiences just straight up spiritual community can say like, "Oh, it's just spiritual awakening. You don't need to worry about it." Like, but sometimes it actually does overlap with mental health. Sometimes it may be like a mental health episode and there could be both going on, but I wouldn't recommend that people actually continue to expand that awakening if they're not grounded in 3D reality, and if they're not able to function, sleep-wake schedules, like, getting paranoid or, like, just their physical functioning's falling apart, I don't think it's a good idea to keep opening up. Again, I don't think psychology has all the answers, just like spirituality doesn't have all the answers for every person, there's still a long way we have to go. But, yeah, so sometimes and then on the other side of it too, even the spiritual side, it's psychology can dismiss it where it can be very, very actually helpful, very reassuring. I don't even know if I'd actually to be honest, I don't know if I'd still be in the field if I didn't have these tools to work with and these ways of working. Because basically since, like, pandemic and a lot of therapists are in the same thing that clients are going through, and if you're only looking at cognitive
Right.
rational mind, like, I'm in a lot of therapist group where people post privately of just like, "Well, how do you help people through a lot of these things, like climate change, political stuff, like, what's the
Yeah.
rational thing that helps people feel better?" And like, a lot of times the rational mind won't, it'll just keep spinning and just keep being anxious, and so I've been really fortunate in just my own connection and helping people establish that and strengthen that connection for themselves. It's like that's where like messages or knowing of like on a certain level everything's okay can come in and they can actually leave feeling better than when they came in. Um but and again, but I am a big proponent of both, like spiritual being in human nervous system because sometimes some of the spiritual stuff can go too far in terms of like, well, your thoughts create your reality or like don't think anything bad. And it can really bypass the human like condition of we are here, we are in an evolved nervous system. Like there's certain things that means in terms of how our body stores negative emotional memory. There's the universal emotions, like being spiritual isn't about never feeling sad or upset about something, and you can't just positively think your way out of an actual real trauma response. So I think there's benefits in both worlds.
Um, that's actually that's super interesting to me because obviously I don't have any psychological training or anything like that. The only thing I have is some spiritual experiences with meditation and some other practices that I've been doing on and off myself. But I mean, obviously, um, there is this whole mental health aspect, and maybe can you tell us a little bit more about like how difficult is that? Because you just talked about the balancing act that you have to go through. Like, is it always very black and white to say, okay, now we're in this area, and maybe the spiritual practice actually has more beneficial things than not? Like, how can you actually um because, yeah, like you said, just that's basically the whole dilemma pretty much, right? Figuring
For
out
sure.
what
Yeah, and I do
to
have some
find.
free resources that go through because I have a free quiz on my website, and it also has some free resources of, like, here's some things to look out for, like, this is not a substitute for
Mm,
one-on-one guidance at all, but it's just more of, like, here's things to kinda look at. Uh, because again, sometimes friends and family of people can be concerned because it might be like, "Oh, you're talking to angels," or "This thing gave you a message," or "This deceased person did," and it's
mm,
like, "Are you actually okay, or are you having a psychotic break?" And most of the
right,
time, if we still have for most people, if they're still I'm not an expert in the psychosis-based illness, so a lot of times if there's questions about that, I would refer somebody or really strongly recommend and really push for, like, getting that assessed somewhere else. It's important to kinda know our
mm,
own limits of what we can work with and what we don't. I do a lot more work with people who are more, like, grounded in but sometimes, again, sometimes you don't know. So I'd always be talking with people one-on-one about, like, okay, if we're starting to, like, have symptoms that could be something else, like, I really want them to connect with someone else. And you need to kind of meet people where they're at as well. But a lot of times, like, a general kind of rule of thumb is if people kind of have that observing ego where they're still functioning, like they can go to work, they're sleeping pretty regularly, getting up normally, like they can function in the 3D world, keeps their routines, their habits. Often even knowing, like, having a filter still where you're like, I know who I could maybe talk to about this. And I also know how this might sound to other people. And there's like a stop
right,
there. Most people have that, and so I have a lot of clients who will say things like, it's like, "I wouldn't ever I've never told another therapist this or this," because they're like, "I know how this sounds." Like, I don't want them taking notes and being like, take this antipsychotic or do this thing." So and usually they kind of many people like this kind of blend into regular life. Like, there's a
mm,
book, I forget the exact title of it now, but they've studied kind of researchers and scientists who've gone through spiritual awakenings, and it's
mm,
actually very common. Like, I was surprised at the stats of how common spiritual experiences are. Um, the Gallup poll out of the US that asked people if they've ever had a spiritual or religious experience that, like, significantly changed the course of their life, and about 41% rated it as a 5 out of 5. Like, that's almost half the
oh,
population rating it as high as possible of, like, significant change. And for
yeah,
me, it changed the course of my life. It changed the direction of my work. I know so many people where it has, but there still is so much fear and stigma, and I think a lot of that is tied to the Western medical system of, like, if we talk about this, there's fear of being discredited, people thinking you're, like, quote, unquote, "crazy," being li and so I think a lot of people have these experiences but are careful who they share those with, if they even share them at all.
right. Um, I just had a question in my head, but I obviously don't know if that's too far of a question. But since you said Western, like Western medicine in particular, um, why do you believe the Western medicine and psychology teachings and all that developed in the way they did, if we compare it to the Eastern, more spiritual teachings?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm equipped to fully answer that more. I just think a lot of it is like the history of the DSM and stuff is based in the medical system. I often talk with people about diagnostic stuff because I'm trained as a counseling psychologist first, so I wasn't trained strongly in terms of like medical model training and clinical of like here's a diagnosis, everybody needs a diagnosis. My training was more of like strengths based, see the good in people, and also diagnostic labels often I find in practice they can be very helpful for people. Sometimes they're necessary. You may need it for accommodations, for more time for exams at school. Like there can be benefits to it, But I often talk with people about it to say, like, there's many people where it can be a helpful thing because it helps them make sense of what's going on. It can help destigmatize it. It can help give them a roadmap forward. It can help, like, them not feel like they're failing or something's wrong with them, to help understand, like, here's a body of research and literature of, like, this, whether it's ADD, anxiety, depression, it can help
Mm.
understand what's happening. On the flip side of it too, it's like there's also places where the DSM is kind of like it's a living, breathing document. It's in its 5th edition right now. There's some places that we like there's a lot more history with. Psychology is a relatively new science in terms of scientific fields. Like, it's only just over 100 years old that it's existed. It's if we look, like, a couple generations back, like, some pretty shady stuff is going on. So, a lot of it, we don't operate the exact same way. It's evolving. I think there's lots of benefit. It's
Yeah.
not knocking the whole thing. Like, we know a lot more. It's always evolving. But I think sometimes we can get so kind of blinded on in terms of our own time period, and many times there is this expert role where you need to know what you know, but it's like some of this may actually we're hopefully we're gonna know more as a field in another decade, another generation, like, get better at treating things, like, have better understandings. And so even I think in I can't remember if it's the 2nd or 3rd version. I mean, I wasn't in the field at this time, it was before my time, but, like, homosexuality used to be in the DSM. Like, now we know, like, "Oh, that should not be
Mm.
there." Like, hysteria stuff was. So, sometimes there's things of, like, some of this may change or evolve, some of these diagnostic labels may be dropped, like, it is an evolving science, but it's yeah, I again, and I do think I do see with a lot of professionals, like, that there is more and more people open to the spirituality piece because 'cause they're individuals having their own experiences, they're guided to it, like, I didn't know what I was looking for at the time when I, like, took off to India, but I was looking for, like, I felt like there had to be something more. That just because a lot of my graduate school training was really conscious mind approaches, like, just change your like, what identify the thought, change the thought, and there's value in recognizing what we're thinking and how our thoughts impact our reality. I just don't think it actually goes deep enough for most people. And it certainly didn't for me. I was like, I can analyze my own issues from all these different lenses. I can trace it back generationally, but it's still here. So for me, it was
Mm.
more learning to work with the nervous system and more of also the intuitive piece played a key role for me as well because I realized in my awakening that I'm actually empathic. So I process other energy through my body that's not all mine, and Western psychology doesn't acknowledge that as a potential at all.
True. Um, Another thing that just came to my mind was because you talked about how the science always evolves, how we always adapt and we change it because we are looking into it and because it is a science. So, what you also said is we obviously are in this human body and we have this human experience. That's why it is important to be grounded in that and to be like all set in that field. But there is this whole other non-human experience.
Mhm.
So do you see that also maybe evolving? I don't know if science would be the right word, but as a thing that we just acknowledge as existing so that we can like expand on it, so that we can learn and kind of like the thing you said with the DSM, have a manual where we kind of just see, okay, things are changing. This is where we at right now. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, I think it's already happening, to be honest. Like, I do there are it's not at the point where it's kind of commonly accepted in terms of, like, community mental health agencies, insurance companies.
Mm.
It's like a lot of times it's still kind of CBT or certain ones that have been around for a long time, but there are more and more professionals. Like, I'm definitely not the first person speaking about this. There's people who've laid the groundwork long before me and very grateful for them. But I mean, even just some of the people, there's like Dr. I think it's Brian Weiss. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I mean, he's a psychiatrist. He's got a number of books about past life regression and he stumbled on it. Like, he got frustrated with the client, was like, just go where this started. And they went into another lifetime. And he wasn't someone for a long time. He's like, oh, I don't know what this is. Like, it seems to help. And now he speaks more publicly of like, I think there's actually this is actually, I think this actually happens. I also like in my book, I talk about kind of like red flags too, just because there's just places where it's kind of a two-sided piece. It's like I want to open up the discussion for people to say like the spirituality piece can be incredibly healing. There's actually more and more research in neuroscience like is catching up to the spiritual principles to say like our brains actually seem to be designed to not only like connect, almost put out a prayer request, but also receive information back from this larger field. And that gets into almost like the quantum physics nature of the universe is like
Mm.
one unified field and we're a part of it. So if that level of science is saying like this is actually the nature of reality and it's all energy and there isn't actually it's not we perceive it as separate, but it's not you can't actually physically separate it at any point. Then the intuition piece, I think it's more of like, well, this is our I think it's almost a human birthright that we all have some level of access to it. I mean, sometimes you have to work more to develop it. There can be other things that get in the way, but I don't think it's actually rare. I think we all have it in different ways and at different levels. And it is a way of us like kind of receiving messages from this larger field that when people have that experience of like if it's a positive spiritual awakening experience, it's very loving, it's very peaceful, it's like a profound shift when people experience that direct connection. Doesn't mean we always hold on to it in day-to-day life because, like, being a human is hard a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I wanted to ask. So what do you think? Um, I mean, let's say there's probably two kind, or maybe more, but let's say two kinds of people. One that haven't really experienced intuition at all yet, because that's just all they know, and they hadn't like reached that feeling ever. But there is people who have reached it and know kind of, sort of what it feels like because it's more like a feeling thing, not really a can't really define it on paper, or maybe you can. Um, but what do you think is in our society and our day to day life? What is holding us back um, to reach like that state of being?
Yeah, there's a few different things. I'd say even when you say for people who don't believe it, my counter to that is many people don't really believe in the whole spiritual awakening or is there more there? But if you actually break it down, many people do believe in some kind of intuition, but they may call it different things. Like business
Mm,
people, it'll often be like a business sense or like a gut feeling or like a knowing. And so our
right.
intuition can pull from our existing information where sometimes it senses patterns and gets stuff really quickly that other people may not see or we may not have had before. Most people when I kind of share this story will also have some experience that resonates for themselves. For me, the seed planting of intuition being real for me was experiences of me not listening to it. Like it being very loud, very warning, being like, do not trust this person. Something's going on here. And my logical mind like overriding it to be like, you're being crazy. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, there's no evidence for this. And then later getting evidence to be like, oh, no, that was right the whole time. Like that knowing that was something to listen to. So I think in for most of us who aren't raised or taught to trust that part of ourselves, we often realize it's real by not listening to it and ignoring it. And then after that, we're like, there's something to that. I
Mm,
want to listen to that more. That was trying to help me. So that also ties into because the intuition when intuitive information is very helpful. It's almost like our own personal little compass or kind of like GPS system, but it's only going to give us like one turn at a time. It doesn't give us the entire
mm,
like you're going to turn right, then left, and in 500 meters, this is going to happen. Our rational mind really wants that. So the rational learning to trust it's a process and that is one of the barriers. And so I usually wouldn't recommend to that if people start getting spiritual and intuitive experiences that they make major life decisions based on that alone because you should take some time to get really grounded in it to see it kind of filters through our logical mind so we can get an impression and knowing and our logical mind might jump in and fill in all these details about it that actually aren't true and it's not intuitive anymore. So until you're really strong in it and you really have a lot of experience and a lot of like trust needs to be people talk about like trust the journey a lot of the time and it's great to a certain
mm,
degree, but trust is earned. You shouldn't trust a stranger you just met. Like be open to possibilities, but have boundaries, like let it get have time, like see real evidence. I would not believe or be speaking about intuition if I had these spiritual experiences and they never amounted to anything and they never like came true. They never actually predicted things. I have so much of that now that I'm like, there's something here and I listen to it when it comes. And even with a high level of trust and a high level of ability, it's still like intuitive and rational often need to both be there if it's a major emotional decision or like big life decision. So I think one part is when it's more emotionally tied for us and there's more on the line, like, that's when we really want that clear answer, and that's also when we're like, least likely to be able to access it, especially if we're just starting out. Like, to grow that ability, it helps a lot to, first of all, know what your dominant sense is, like, and I have that quiz on my website to give people an idea of that. It's not, like, a scientifically diagnosis validated, it's more for fun, but when you
Mhm.
know the gateway that sensory that comes through for you the strongest, it's like then you can start really intentionally meditating with that one. And getting out of your rational mind, having times where you can connect with it and connecting with it when it's low stakes. So really being, you're going to meet a friend of a friend you've never met before. If you get more visions, just being like, what's the impressions I'm noticing if I imagine going to their house or meeting them? Like, what's in my mind's eye? What's this? Because then you can also get that feedback in reality to see like, was I accurate with it? And if you're way
Yeah.
off, you're like, okay, that was not intuition, like something else was going on there. But you get better at recognizing like the subtle shifts and like the subtle messages, and you get better at interpreting that. And when there's nothing on the line, it's easier to read that. And sometimes like if I first realized the intuition was a thing in an intuitive development workshop, so it was more like guided exercises with people I didn't know. So my rational mind had nothing to actually draw from. And so that like that I that it, that course like still stands out for me because it's like that's when I realized I was empathic. I was like, "Holy crap, like how long has this been going on?" I had no idea till that point that like my internal state could shift so dramatically depending on who I was with and like who I was tuned into. Like there was a few exercises where I could describe like the emotions I was feeling, even physical pain or sensations, and it was exactly what the other person was going through. And then it was
Mhm.
shift like entirely shift again working with someone else. So s- things like that can be very helpful to explore it. Also, intuition will let us know when we are doing that, being more aware of our inner world. We have to tune out what's intuition and also like what's our old nervous system residue stuff. Like this is almost like trauma stuff. And it doesn't have to be PTSD level trauma. It might be like this might be a subconscious belief. It might be a childhood or ancestral thing. Like there's some block here that was
Mhm.
adaptive at some point, that was protective at some point. But sometimes if we feel like restriction, if we feel anxiety, if we feel like a fear, like, oh no, this is such a bad idea, it's like that might not actually be intuition. This may be based on the past because our subconscious is designed to really protect us and keep us safe, but it doesn't automatically update. We have to like actually update it ourselves.
So, I actually have 2 questions, but I'm gonna ask, because you just mentioned trauma, so I'm gonna stick with that first. So obviously that's another super interesting thought is how do I make that out? Like how can I for myself objectively find out what is it that's speaking to me? Is it intuition? Is it trauma? How do I feel that out?
Yeah. Um, it's a complex answer, so I'll try to do my best to give kind of a Coles Notes version. One of my teachers in transpersonal psychology, Dr. Beth Hedva, she talks about it's like calm, open heart, calm body, clear mind. So if those three are there, you have pure intuition. Intuition is never fear based. It's never scary. Um, it's but if one of those isn't there, we're not fully at like the intuitive truth yet. So intuition is often just a knowing. Sometimes with that knowing though, then our logical mind and our anxiety or past stuff can jump in and be like, "Oh, no, I don't like this answer. I don't want to look at this." So usually if there's it fear-based doesn't mean it's trauma necessarily. Trauma often shows up in our nervous system of like there's usually some kind of past experience. The tricky part with it is we don't it's not always verbal. Like we may not have verbal memory of it. It could be really young we could be carrying it and it's not attached to a memory specifically, but it's often more of if there's similar situations, and I think it does take time to develop that, it does take practice, it's not kind of a light switch thing, but the more we're aware of, like, parts where it can be a helpful way from psychology, trauma processing, really being like, "Hey, what" if we can get more clear of, like, what energy is coming up for me in this? Like, where is the fear? Is it mine? Not mine? How old or how young is it? Like, we often have to sit with it with, like, curiosity, compassion, but we also need a window of tolerance and enough safety. Because the hard part with trauma activation is to actually help heal it and move through it, we don't wanna be so far into fight or flight that we're just re-traumatizing it. So, again, that's why it's like spiritual and psychology can go together really well, and I see sometimes if it's just spiritual, like, that can do a disservice to people who are more complex trauma survivors because some people may actually need, like, medication and, like, stability, safety, other things in place first before it's safe enough to start doing that work that it's not re-traumatizing them. Um, a history of complex trauma can make people more vulnerable to a traumatic spiritual awakening as well too. Like sometimes it can start being destabilizing or not helpful as one piece. So again, it's like everybody's path is kind of unique to them. There's no one answer that works for everyone. That's a big takeaway I want people to have because it's also when you get into like teachers and facilitators and people in spiritual spaces, there's some out there who are fantastic and they're amazing, but it's so much harder, I think, for the average person to kind of tune out like who's actually safe to work with here. Um, and registered health professionals, like there's definitely there's I'm not saying like those are immune because there are issues. Probably a big part of our own, like even psychologist professional liability insurance is like ethical violations by therapists. Is like
Mhm.
it's rare, but it happens. It still happens. But I've seen a lot of pretty severe damage happen in unregulated spaces with clients I've worked with in my practice, and I've made some mistakes in that area too, because when you're looking for help and mentorship, like, you're looking for people who are speaking spiritual language who you can talk to, and I know a mistake I made early on was really thinking, like, if people have a certain level of psychic ability or spiritual gifts, it kinda means they're more loving, evolved, safe people, and that is
Mhm.
not always like, that can be not true, and it can also be, like, absolutely not. Like, there can be safer people who have 0 spiritual abilities, like, emotional maturity, safety, personality factors, like, those are things we need to look out for in every area, including spiritual communities too.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing because we at the end all are humans. We all have our flaws and our egos, and just because we are aware of different teachings, we still have these flaws that we have to heal everyone for themselves first before we can actually be
Yeah, and it's
helpful
not there's
to.
never gonna be it's not about working with someone who's fully healed, like, I don't believe that's possible, I don't think but it's if you're actually really going to someone when you're in a really vulnerable state, like someone who's it's like mental health, trauma, you're looking for guidance, you're feeling really lost in this, like, spiritual ability, you want someone who's self-aware enough and has done enough of their own shadow work that they can notice
Mhm.
when their own stuff's coming up, that they have a way to kinda put that aside and keep it out of your work together, that they also know, like, who they work with, who they don't work with, they would refer when that's appropriate. If they can't hold that neutral space with someone, they would refer them to other people. Like, there shouldn't be
Right.
exploitation or boundary violations going on in terms of, like, financial, sexual, friendship, other things, like, I mean, sometimes the friendship piece can be okay, but it's more of, like, if it starts creeping in this of, like, you are now being responsible for meeting their needs in certain ways that aren't the
Mhm.
best, and again, it's almost this piece of, like, are they emotionally aware? Is there a level of maturity there? Do they have enough tools if they're doing, like, deeper work with someone? That they're not, because I mean, I've seen kind of the aftermath of all of it, and sometimes they're people with big names and big followings, like, they're really well known in their community, or they may even be internationally known.
I don't know if that's a fair question at all, but you being in both of these fields, do you have a sense or a feeling if these things are happening more in the spiritual landscape or more in the psychological landscape that there's people that
Yeah,
aren't.
I mean, I can only speak to the experience I have in my own practice and in my own places-based world, so I really wouldn't be able to say, like, statistically, these are the numbers, here's what it is, like, I don't know what to kinda compare it to. The only thing I'd kinda say, again, it's like, just because it's a mental health professional or any professional, it doesn't mean 100% like no one's gonna violate something, but if that's happening, they know better, like, they damn well know better because there is training involved, there's licensing pieces, like, there is no way they don't know that that's not inappropriate. It's like something else has happened, and so I think that's one of the kind of safeties that can be built in place, like professional liability. There's a process to register, like there's a process to get that title. There's certain things you need to get through. If you get into unprotected titles, it's like anyone can use it, like a healer, a coach. Sometimes it's like trauma informed this or that. And it's like, what does that actually mean though? Because that can range from people who have a ton of experience, who've had supervision, who had training, who are actually really good at what they do. It can be someone who took a 20-hour or 10-hour like online self-certification course off the internet and has never worked with anyone before in your life. So certain things, it's like when you know there's a certain level of protection kind of built in with certain registrations. And again, I know there'll be people who say like, oh, it's not everyone. And I totally acknowledge that. Like there can be still be issues there. But I think like, common consumer, and especially if someone's in a vulnerable position, it's knowing, like, some of these titles are not protected at all, like, anyone can use them. I've personally seen more damage come from the unregulated spaces, but I've also seen some in regulated spaces too, or been dealing with aftermath. So I've seen it in both worlds. I just think the spiritual lens, it's a bit harder because also if people have questions of, like, "Was this okay that my therapist did this or doctor did this or like lawyers, like anyone who's a part of an association did this. It's like you can go look online and pull up the code of ethics and be like, what are the
Yeah,
standards here? You can go talk to someone who controls, like, there are regulatory bodies who investigate any, like, there's a code of ethics, there's a standard. It's like to keep that title, you are under that, and they will go investigate. Like the Psychologists Association of Alberta, they also have a fund for people of like, if you've been harmed by a psychologist, like, you can actually access money to help in your recovery. It's like, and if someone really violates something like this, there's a sexual boundary violation by a psychologist, like, they lose their license and they never get that back, and they can never work in any capacity in that way ever again. Like, it is gone for life. If
yeah.
you don't have those kind of titles and stuff, it's like you don't know, and you don't there's no real consequence. Like, you might have to take out a civil lawsuit that is insanely expensive in so many years of your life versus, like, there's some more safety built in. Yeah, and again, I just think because of the spiritual one, it's one of those ones that I know a lot of professional people who do have it as part, like, it's part of their world, it can be part of their practice, but a lot of it is underground or it's word of mouth. Like, it's not easy. If people are Googling things and trying to get answers to stuff, you often get most of the results will get are, like, people in very unregulated spaces. And some of it, there's some of it that's really good, and there's some stuff that's like, "Eh," and there's some stuff that's, like, deeply concerning.
Um, I feel like that is a big issue though, and we kind of talked about it, that these things might need to be more regulated, right? Like we should just adapt them more into the official field, because that would take away a lot of the things that you just mentioned, right? And we would have a code of ethics. We would have all these regulatory things. But yeah, I don't know. Is that like the health field? Is that like governments who don't want
Yeah.
to?
I don't know, and I think, like, I definitely don't claim to have the answers in terms of solutions here. Like, I don't think there are easy, clear-cut solutions because I can understand both sides of arguments of it too. It's like when you get really regulated and really many barriers to access things, it's like that gets less and less accessible for people too. And many kind of ancient, more like traditions, they may not have there's still like a knowledge base there that's been honored for centuries and in their culture, but it's like it may not translate more to like again, we almost get into more like Western colonialization areas.
Mm.
So it's not I guess I don't have the answer for all of that. Like I think there's pieces my main kind of goal or focus is just to help bring more it was kind of my motivation for writing the book was more of like, here are some things to consider. I want information in people's hands so they can kind of make more informed decisions and be like, okay, can I go to some of these checklists? Like, I don't think there is one easy answer. Like, I think even if you regulate, you're still going to have issues somewhere else. It may help. And also, I think there's on the spectrum of kind of like harmful personalities or harmful things. I really do believe I've been in mental health and personal growth, like spirituality work for close to 2 decades now. I believe most harm that I see, most harm that I've experienced myself is well-intentioned people doing the best they can with where they're at. That's the majority. There is a small percentage that I don't think falls into that, where we get into more almost like psychopathy or really like, this is very concerning. This is not just so it's not just missing that everyone's doing the best they can, but and again, that's a whole complicated issue in terms of like, is the disorder, the disability part of it, but it doesn't excuse the harm that's done. Um, I just think because it's not to like demonize anyone who's doing things. It's to help. I want to help people be better informed and have more resources to be like, how do you make a choice? And again, not everything's accessible to everyone as well. I think there's room for, again, psychology to evolve in this, and also people may need, like, more of a team that they work with to be like, maybe they have, like, someone who's more an energy practitioner or someone more in the spiritual realm, but they can work with someone for more of the psychology piece, and they don't need to necessarily, like, be experts in the same thing as long as there's room enough for that person to get their needs met. Um, and so I think it is already starting to go in that direction, like, I hope for that, and I also hope for people because, again, like, going through training as a psychologist, there is so much we go through that we're trained in terms of what's your own stuff coming up. There's, like, your own therapy required. There's your own internal work required. Some of these shorter courses, I think many people, like, really mean well because there is kind of human cognitive bias of when we know a little bit about a subject, like, we actually think we know more than than we do know about it, versus when you really start to become more of an expert, you're like, "Oh, I will never know everything there is to know about this," and you can still be a very, like you can still be an expert, um, and you can be, like, expert level of, like, you could be a court you would qualify as a court expert to testify about it, but um, compared to kind of the average person. So I think a lot of stuff is people might it's often well-meaning people who may get a little bit of stuff and then they and it's I see it a lot with mental health as well because there's kind of a flip side where there's more and more destigmatization, which is great. There's more and more information about mental health accessible, but the kind of problem with it too is sometimes it just gets a little bit too watered down or a little bit too um, this if someone's like, "Oh, there's a little bit about trauma here," and now I'm like, took this little course, now I'm doing all this work. It's like that kind of stuff concerns me because it's like, do you have enough training to actually weed out, like to recognize who you're equipped to work with and like when you need to refer to someone else or like when you need to make sure there's other supports in place? Because again, I don't see this as, like, the norm, but I've seen a trend basically since COVID happened where I've seen even, like, card readers or intuitives, like, pivot, and now suddenly they're giving a keynote speak on depression, and I'm like, "Why are you treating depression? Like, you were an angel card reader. Like, did you set" and there's no evidence in their profile of, like, any training around that, and I'm like, "This gets into scary territory because severe depression comes with a high risk of suicidality or, like, self-harm." And you need to know how to manage that. You need to know how to assess for that safely. So if you suddenly start stepping into this and be like, I can treat this, and someone who doesn't realize it is like, great, you're gonna treat this, this could be bad for everyone. Yeah. So again, I don't think it's like only professionals, there's only space for them, but I think it's more of like how do we have like the professionals and people who can also help within their scope and
Yeah.
work more together in more collaborative care.
So we already discussed a lot of the problems, and we talked about what could happen, and you also touched on a little bit on the things. Um, that can be wrong about a person that we can search up for. But for the people that are looking for help, like, what would you explicitly say are some of these red flags? How can people that have not a lot of knowledge, like you do, like professionals do, like how can
Mhm.
people find these red flags?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have some kinda list in the book as well. I think it's also, like, I don't want it to be all doom and gloom and be like, "This is all bad," as well, too. I think, like, the spirituality piece, there's so much benefit in it. There's so much research that show, like, how much it does help our brain. And a lot of times, I think there is a piece of being, like, looking at a lot of it is kind of the opposite things too, to be like, does this person, like, ask some questions, look for it can help to ask for referrals. It can help to ask I mean, I can help to even test the waters, like, be open to working with different people for different things. I'd also say too, like, it can be very hard to find somebody who does everything. Um,
Mm.
so sometimes it might and I think if anything, I wanna help kind of bring both worlds together a bit more to say, like, sometimes you can be very spiritual and, like, maybe if there are kind of symptoms of mental health going on, like, mental health therapy can be very helpful. Medication might be helpful. Like, and I'm not saying medication as a, like, don't treat any of the underlying issues, but it's kind of like if we're physical, spiritual, like, and mental bodies, we often need to address all of those. And each path is different for different people. I just more want more tolerance in general for people to kind of find their own path and what works for them, and kind of being like, "Okay, how severe is this impacting your life? Like, what tools can be helpful?" Being able to draw from different worlds and, like, bring those together in a way that makes sense for you at the time. And so that might be, like, a doctor, it might be a mental health therapist, it may be also spiritual components, because I see too often for individuals where they, like, cannot do like, kind of pick and choose from different things without it impacting another area. Like, sometimes they're
Mm.
stigmatized in their spiritual communities of like, "Oh, well, you're not trying hard enough because 'cause you're gonna take, like, hormones or, like, potential mental health medication." And, like,
Yeah.
suddenly now we don't like, we're judging you. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why, again, I find you pretty interesting because, like I said, I had these people in my friend groups, and I know how the divide can be between
Mhm.
those fields. And um, maybe to bring it back to something, because I still have that one question in my mind from
Mhm.
a couple of minutes ago. Um, how was that for you personally, or maybe how is it still? Because when you were talking about the intuitive mind and how people need to also learn how to use intuition, get to know it better and feel it out. Um, and yeah, maybe to learn a bit from your own experience with it. Is there sometimes still struggles where you're like, oh, this intuition is so loud, but then the rational mind, as you explained as well, is like making all of these things and trying to protect us in a way as well. And so you still struggling with that, mixing these worlds as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely got a lot easier for me. It's not and it's I relate to it differently now because I know in the beginning, I was this way at first when I started realizing intuition was real, started having spiritual experiences, and I see it a lot in clients as well, where oftentimes we compare ourselves to people who kind of are born with these psychic gifts or like might be a psychic or medium where they've like from a young age, like just it's always been part of their world. Like they talk to dead people,
Mhm.
they just get messages, they can see your spirit guides and like that's their name and here's all the things. And so often it can start off as this place of like, I want to find my gifts, like it's a Christmas present. I get to open it and I see what my gift is and I get to play with it. And I really was like eager in that beginning phase to be like, what's my gifts? Like I really want to know. I want it this way. And I've like now I relate to it very differently. I'm like, oh, that's not actually how it works. It's more working where you're at of, like, finding that dominant ability, being able to tune into it more. It's kinda like wading into a pool from the shallow end to get deeper and deeper. Like, in the beginning, it takes a lot more work to get to that deeper end. When you have a lot of experience with it, like, the way it shows up for me now is, like, I'm kinda one foot in both worlds a lot of the time, and I've also done a lot of kind of deeper healing work on my own subconscious inner child stuff, so I wouldn't describe I'm not primarily empathic anymore, but I worked hard to not be because I don't like it. It's I don't I'm okay to notice it and be aware, but I'd rather get intuitive information from, like, I'm in my bubble and this is my energy in here, and I'm not just taking on everything all the time because that's very
Yeah.
overwhelming and distressing. And you don't need to. Like, it's also you can get the information you need. I'm like, I'd rather have it as a message. Like, but that was a lot of work over a really long time to shift that. Um, so, but it does like it evolves and shifts and changes over time. And it can evolve and shift as we do like our own deeper healing work or like belief system work. Because even like I've heard things around like empathic, this is just how it is. Like Dr. Judith Orloff is a psychiatrist who talks about empathic ability, and her book's fantastic. But I've found personally in my own experience and working with clients, there is a level of accepting this and working with it, but there is deeper healing we can do where we don't have to be as empathic or like we can strengthen the other gifts and kind of work with like inner child stuff, belief systems of like why we feel we need to take it on all the time. So it's not as intense. Like it's not, it doesn't, it used to be very, I'd have to do a lot of energetic clearing and protection work like daily, a lot of the time. I don't have to do that anymore at the same level because I've done deeper work that's like kind of just changed my energetic boundaries things. But yeah, I think it is developed like practicing over time, getting the experience. And they're not separate because it's like they're both parts of our brain. And our culture really teaches us from such a young age to only rely on logic and dominant that we're often even like even told as a young kid of like, oh no, nobody's upset. Like, what are you talking about? Or like, oh, just give them a hug.
Mm.
Like, don't know if you feel uncomfortable. We're often actively like taught to override it, even if it's well intentioned. I think that is changing. I see that changing in parenting, which is exciting. Um, and so I think it's really more about how do we let intuition do what it needs to do and logic can support that. So there's definitely still times in my life where like and the intuitive again is like the GPS system of like it's just telling you to turn left and you're like, "Well, what do I do after that?" And it's like, "No, turn left." Like it doesn't give you the whole thing. So part of the process is getting more comfortable with being like, I am just in more unknown and I actually am not controlling everything and I can do what I can when I have the information. And there's other times where you're like, I kind of just have to wait or be in process or like just do other things but not worry about this too much because the timing will come. But it's like the intuitive mind does not operate on the commands of the logical mind. And so that is that is an unlearning part of having them learn to work together better.
Yeah. I feel like, and again, that's just my feeling. I don't have any knowledge about that, but I feel like anxiety comes exactly from, or sometimes from, these things. Just we should be content, waiting it out. But then the logical mind is trying to be like, "What do you mean? I should just be content for like a day, for a week? I need to be doing things. I need to be." Um, so I feel like that's a self-caused problem in a way as well. Um, it, when you mentioned the things about, especially with children, about feelings, you feel like that might be a hindrance to like be fully aware and like listen to one's own body as well, because we're just not really for like the more negative feelings, we're kind of taught not to let them in, not to, like you said, override them. So we can't really experience them fully and we can't really learn how to deal with them. You see that as a problem as well.
Yeah, I talk about that too in terms of the like toxic positivity and kind of toxic spirituality is more of
Mm.
it's like we're not allowed to don't feel bad emotions. It's gonna attract bad things to you. And there is again, there's always this like kind of window of tolerance piece too, where the more like, part of that emotional maturity piece and being able to like, ride the waves is actually being able to recognize the emotions, to give them space when they need space, like, be able to feel them in safe ways, be able to kind of have like, be able to release and move through them. Because if we're always just like, "Nope, put that away," like, "Put that in the
Mm,
closet, close the door," like, they pile up and they will influence us in more subconscious ways, which is usually not the way we wanna act. Like, it can be be real like, being very nice, being like, I should take care of this person. I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine," and then it's like blow up and you yell at them or you're like, "I behaved in a way I didn't want to." It's those are a natural swing. Like, those are go together. The bypassing the emotion, not recognizing it, like, our emotions, sometimes they're there to just feel, to move through. Sometimes they actually have important information for us too, where and there's many pathways. So anxiety can come from many different reasons. For me personally, my anxiety level is a lot lower than it was kind of pre-awakening and pre-learning to trust this because I just have more trust of that. Like, I've had enough messages and things come through where I'm like, if I'm connected and following this, like, even when things are hard, there feels like there's more of a purpose to it. It feels tied to my own like soul growth and evolution. It feels like it's more happening like for me or to show me something or to like unlock another level of kind of my own healing and the spiral journey. So it's like I relate to life differently because of it. I don't feel as thrown around. I can come back to more of a knowing and like I have trust in that. Like I have many many experiences of messages that then later were actually verified or that were then like, "Oh, this makes sense now. Like this really helped me be ready for this." But I would have had no way of knowing that was coming logically.
yeah, that's something that definitely helped me as well. So basically, I just really believe that things happen for a reason. And what I tell a lot of people, even if they don't subscribe to the like spiritual thing
Mhm,
that entails, it, in my opinion, is just very beneficial to your life
mhm.
in general because you can, like you said, you can see these connections and it kind of removes you from this sort of victim role and
Mhm.
it rather empowers you because you can see, oh, so what can I learn from this? Like you said, so what is this trying to teach me? And
Yeah.
I feel like that's a very good way
For sure, and it
for
can be super helpful, but again, it's like the spiritual and a human experience. It's almost this like nesting doll situation we all have going on, where if people are really ready for that and that's coming through, I've had messages like that. I have a lot of clients where that will come through, where it's like this happened for a reason, or this is a soul connection, and it can feel super healing, validating. Like it can help them just let it go and move on. But it's not a piece of if you're not there and those feelings aren't there yet, like you don't just get it doesn't help to just go like, bypass that and be like, "Well, it happens for a reason." It's like, we're also human. And so there's there's different parts of our being that I think it's more of like there's enough space for all of these parts to exist. And sometimes our human self has to have space to be like, I'm really upset with this. Like this effing sucks. And I'm so like this isn't fair. It's not right. And it's not. Like there is a piece of on a human level. Sometimes there's harm, there's betrayal, there's things of like, this shouldn't have happened. It's not right. It's not okay. It doesn't mean the spiritual piece doesn't mean we don't do the things in the 3D world we may need to do, because sometimes the lesson for people can be more of, like, self-love and self-protection. Anger is a great emotion for that. Oftentimes with anger, it's like something's not right or okay here. This may be like, do we need to seek legal action? Do we need to limit contact with people? Like, do we need to actually make a change here that's, like, better serving for us? And, like, if forgiveness comes later with that, it can, but it's not like, "Oh, it happens for a reason, so I keep tolerating this," or I don't do anything when I can do something.
right. Yeah, it's as with everything, I guess it's that nuance, like you said. It's trying to figure out because yeah, we're still dealing with humans in the human world, so obviously
Yeah,
we shouldn't just accept things and be like, yeah, this
for sure.
this
And there can
happened.
be that this happened for a reason, like, both can exist as well. There can be the piece of, like, this happened, this and what do I need to take care of myself? What feels right as a next step? And sometimes we need if it's like if we're not in a space of feeling that, like we may need more safe space to feel more of the harder emotions or the more difficult emotions to really help move through those so that the like more naturally sometimes the forgiveness or the spiritual process, like, it just happens when we give ourselves the space to have what we need and, like, safe healing spaces. It's not necessarily like you force this to happen. It's kind of like a byproduct of like, almost the image I'm getting as we're talking about it, it's like watering and giving sunshine to a flower, it, like, eventually blooms, but you don't pry it open.
Right. Um, I'm trying to think us how to ask that as a very broad question, but then I also don't know if asking it as a broad question is the best way of asking it. But with everything that we discussed and everything that you know that you learned in your journey as well, um, what would you say is a good way for people who are basically at a state where they're trying to find purpose in life, you know, finding a way pretty much of how they should go through life. Maybe they are a little bit lost. And with all the teachings and the stuff that you have at your hand, how would you approach people like that?
Yeah, I think there's a few different kind of ways as well. Again, it's a lot of it is kind of the GPS metaphor too, like the directions you're gonna get to get you somewhere are gonna depend on where you're starting from or like
Mm,
where your starting point is. So sometimes there can be places of like if someone's really struggling and it's like it's hard to feel good, it's just hard to exist day to day. Sometimes you might need some support and more focused like healing treatment to get to a place where, like, the clouds have lifted a little bit more. Because if we're
mm,
really burnt out, if we're in a depressive state, if we're highly traumatized, it's like you can't it's not easy to connect with that in those states, and sometimes it's almost impossible. It's just so much harder there. So, sometimes there's pieces of, like, what will help make this easier or help lift some of this out of the way, what might be going on here. Other times, sometimes people are like, things are relatively good. They have a lot of the material things they want, basic needs are covered, they have a job, but this is kind of this like, is this it feeling? Like,
mm,
what else? And I think a lot of people can relate to that as well. And sometimes with the is this it? Like that's where it's almost more of like the spirituality and the neuroscience piece of we're in our we're really raised in a very like capitalistic consumeristic society which is very much like achievement oriented brain and so but the research and the brain studies have shown that when we're only an achievement oriented brain our those brains are less healthy, they're less resilient, they're more prone to anxiety, they're more prone to depression, they're not as rich in meaning or purpose. Purpose isn't just like our titles, what we do, what we have, who we are. It is and it's different for every person, but it is more of like that's where more of the spiritual states of like just being flow. Like, what are your higher order values? Is that time with family? Is that the difference you can make where you are? And it's and again in this like social media type world, like it's not always this like build an empire, be an influencer thing. It may be like what's your little zone like ripple effect in your own little community and world? Like what's how do you wanna be given everything that's going on? What has meaning for you? Because and that can be very different for different people. So sometimes it's trying different things and, like, I think it is also important to know material wealth, money, like, it's definitely important. The research does show very clearly of, like, if people do not have enough to meet their basic needs, like, happiness levels and well-being drop dramatically. It makes sense. But after that, it's a lot more complicated. And after that, it's not reliably tied to like it it's not like you have more things and your happiness goes up, like, that's not necessarily true at all. Like, it can influence things if people use it to buy time to be able to have more time in their values, it can, but if it's more like I'm just chasing the next rat race and the next thing, and I, like, achieve that, and right away, I'm empty again, and I need more and more and more, like, it's this unfulfilled, like, black hole that will never be enough. I think that's where the spirituality piece is like, sometimes we're distracted with things, like buying stuff, being busy, scrolling online, doing things to fill like a hole that's like a source God-sized unconditional love hole, that it doesn't come from those things. It comes from that connection, and it comes from us, like, with that connection radiating that out in the world in whatever way we feel called to.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I agree with that message so much. And I feel um, like you said, in this world, it is easy. It's the easiest to basically just make money that goal and basically feel happy in a way, but then well, do you really feel happy? That's the other thing again. Maybe we conditioned ourselves to kind of feel like that's what happiness should feel
When we can
like.
get a
And
high,
then
we can get a quick hit and a high of, like, "I achieved this thing, I'm so happy about this, I got the new car, I got the promotion, I got this," but the thing is, like, does it last?
yeah, and it usually doesn't. Because like
Yeah,
you said, then
yeah,
my neighbor has a bigger car and they
yeah,
have a nicer house. And um so I feel like gratitude is a big thing there as well.
mhm,
To just um help us not get into that nonsensical pursuit because um obviously everyone needs to be able to um live a good life.
mhm,
Like you said, like you need to have some kind of resources. But
mhm,
then if you're able to do that, everything else is basically just,
mhm.
yeah, not
Yeah,
really
and I think,
necessary.
there's a good book called The Awakened Brain that talks a lot about, like, the neuroscience piece. A lot of I would agree that a lot of kind of teachers in that area who talk about, like, building that connection, having more of that purpose, like, meditation can be such a strong tool. It's such a, like, essential doorway. Like, we need spots to be able to just get out of our, like, busyness and doing. Um, I'd also a challenge I'd often give to clients too, if it resonates with them and they're looking for that meaning or purpose, it might be putting it out as like a prayer request. And again, this is more
Mm,
spiritual. It doesn't necessarily need to be religious. So use whatever language resonates with you, whether that's like God, universe, source, higher self, future self, spirit animal, like whatever terminology, but like something that's all loving and has your highest good in mind. Instead of just going over it in a thought process, just, like, ask for guidance and help and be open over time to see what kind of synchronicities, what kind of intuitive messages come through. I talk about a story in the book as well. I went through there was a few years, and there was a year that was very intense for me when I went through my spiritual awakening, but also was working as a like, in mental health, but completely
uh,
separate, like, not blending those worlds at all, and I was going through a big internal flux kind of about like, well, what do I do going forward here? Because I'm having all these experiences. I'm getting all this feedback with like practice work here. Again, not client work, not overlapping, but I was like, my whole worldview is changing. I'm seeing stuff happen that I've not taught possible here. Like I'm actually more drawn to this. But I've spent like almost a decade training in this, like busting my
mm,
butt to get here, and am I gonna just walk away from this? And, people like, I finally just am in a position where I can actually start working, paying off debt, other things, and am I gonna give this up and go spiritual path? Because at that point, I didn't see how to put them together, and I was,
right.
like, I was very stressed going over that decision over and over again for months, and I was washing dishes in my old apartment, and I put the dish soap down, and this bubble came out and just, like, floated right
Mm,
level, and it ended up just, like, taking a path down the hallway, and it ended up turning 3 different times. It stayed completely eye level and at the same pace the entire time. There was no fans, no airflow, like, I've never seen a bubble behave
right.
like that ever in my life. It went into a room that I had set up as, like, an energy work, like, meditation room, hovered over kind of the table I had set up and popped, and then it was full body goosebumps and, like, full knowing of, "I will not get a more clear answer than this." Like, it was like,
Mm,
"This is the way." It was still years and a lot of training and a lot of searching to be like, "How do I bring them together?" But I like, when that question would come up again, I was like, "I'm not gonna get it more like, I already have an answer." So, that was, like, the trust now, like, now figure it out.
That's a yeah. Um, I feel like that's such a great story. That's a good place for us to wrap it up as well. We discussed a lot of interesting things already, and yeah, had a lot of topics that people hopefully can get inspired by and also helped by, and see the field with a certain awareness, caution as well, as we should all things. So that was also very, very helpful. Um, so yeah, if you just want to tell us lastly, the people that all this resonated with, where can they find you? Where can they find your book that we talked about as well? Yeah, where can we find you online?
Thanks, yeah, so, probably the best place to find everything is at katieturnerpsychology.com. Under there, I believe it's a resource tab or something, but it has like free resources, kind of interviews. The book is under there, like where you can find the book is under there too. The free quiz will pop up and it has a 6 week, it has a free like resource of 6 weeks of like deepen your intuition challenge that comes with that. So people can find me there.
Cool. I'll definitely put that link in the description as well, so everyone can find it easily. Um, So yeah, thank you, Katie, so much for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation, letting us into your journey, sharing your experiences and insights with us. Yeah, it was a good one,
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
of course. All right,
All right,
bye,
take care.
everyone.